Under the fractured gaze of a winter moon, a lone arrow carved its path through the veil of night, seeking not flesh, but fate. Brenna Skye had long since learned to trust the wind's secrets over the hollow promises of pack oaths. At 26, she was no delicate bloom wilting in the shadow of alphas, but a scout forged in the borderland's unrelenting bite. Her skin etched with scars like frost patterns on bark, her eyes the color of storm-tossed slate. The cold reach pines stretched around her like silent sentinels, their needles heavy with fresh snow, whispering warnings as she crouched low in the ravine. The air hung thick with the scent of pine sap and distant smoke, a prelude to the ambush she had scented hours ago on the chill breeze. Exile had claimed her not in a dramatic banishment, but in the quiet erosion of belonging. Born an Omega in the Ironfang pack, Brenna had been overlooked, her instincts dismissed as whimsy rather than wisdom. "Stay in the dens," her alpha had growled years prior, after she warned of a raid that never came, or so they claimed when the raiders struck anyway, leaving her siblings' blood to stain the snow. She had risen then, not with claws, but with cunning, volunteering for the border patrols where Omegas were expendable shadows. No mate had claimed her, no rank elevated her. She was the wind itself, unseen, unfelt, until the storm broke. Tonight, the storm was no metaphor. The Alpha King Kaidor's procession wound through the ravine, a line of armored wolves under banners of silver and black, their breaths clouding the frigid air like ghosts fleeing the dawn. Brenna had been assigned as an outrider, her role to melt into the tree line and report threats. But the wind carried more than whispers now. The acrid tang of rival steel, the faint tremor of paws on frozen earth. Shadowclaw assassins, she knew, emboldened by the fragile truce that had held the northern packs in uneasy peace. Kaidor Rune, at 39, ruled not with the brute fire of youth, but with the tempered steel of a king haunted by ghosts. Whispers in the camps spoke of his guilt, the weight of a crown stained by a betrayal that had cost his first mate her life. He rode at the vanguard, his massive frame cloaked in furs, eyes scanning the darkness with the weariness of one who had seen too many moons rise on bloodied fields. She watched him from her perch, hidden among the roots of a fallen pine, her heart a steady drum against the cold. There was no reverence in her gaze, only the sharp assessment of a survivor. His presence stirred something primal, an unwelcome pull in her veins, like the moon tugging at hidden tides. But Brenna shoved it down. Instinct had betrayed her before. The first arrow whistled before she could signal, a shadowclaw bolt, tipped with silver to pierce royal hide. Time fractured. Kaidor twisted in his saddle, his war cry a thunder that shook the snow from branches, but the arrow flew true, aimed for the vulnerable hollow of his throat. Brenna moved without thought, her body launching from the underbrush like a specter unleashed. The world blurred into white and gray, the crunch of her boots on ice, the burn in her lungs, the howl of wind that seemed to urge her forward. She collided with him mid-leap, her smaller form a shield against the inevitable. The arrow struck not his heart, but her shoulder, the impact a blaze of agony that pinned her to the frozen ground beneath his horse's stamping hooves. Pain bloomed, hot and merciless, blood seeping warm against the snow's chill embrace. She gasped, tasting iron on her tongue, her vision swimming as the ravine erupted into chaos. Kaidor's guards roared to life, steel clashing against steel, weavos piercing the night like shattered glass. Shadows detached from the trees, assassins in mottled cloaks, their eyes gleaming with feral hunger. One lunged at the king, but Kaidor was already dismounted, his sword a silver arc that severed the attacker's arm in a spray of crimson. Blood painted the snow, vivid against the white, steaming in the cold air. Brenna lay there, the arrow's shaft a cruel anchor, her fingers clawing at the earth as waves of nausea rolled through her. Why? The question flickered in her mind, unbidden. She was no hero, no cherished packmate. an Omega scout, left to die in the borders more than once. Yet her body had chosen, instinct overriding the logic of self-preservation. Above her, Kaidor's silhouette loomed, his breath ragged as he dispatched another foe, his fur cloak torn and bloodied, not his own, but close enough to mark the peril. The battle raged in visceral bursts, the wet thud of bodies hitting snow, the metallic tang of spilled life mingling with pine resin, the distant crack of branches under fleeing paws. Brenna's world narrowed to the throb in her shoulder, the cold seeping into her bones, and the king's voice cutting through the din. A command laced with something raw, almost desperate. The scout! Protect the scout! When the last Shadowclaw fell, silenced by a guard's blade, the pack regrouped around them. Warriors knelt in the blood-flecked snow, their eyes not on their king, but on her, the Omega pinned and paling, her dark hair splayed like ink on white parchment. Kaidor dropped to one knee beside her, his gloved hand hovering over the wound, hesitation in the lines of his face. Up close, his eyes were a storm-deep blue, shadowed by the weight of unspoken regrets. The air between them hummed, charged like the hush before a blizzard, an instinctive thread pulling taut despite the pain. "You fool," he murmured, voice rough as gravel under boot, but his touch was steady as he snapped the arrow's fletching and eased her free. Agony lanced through her anew, but she bit back the cry, meeting his gaze with defiant fire. In that moment, as the moon cast its silver light over the carnage, the pack did not see a subordinate bleeding out. They saw a mate who had chosen shield over shadow, instinct over exile. And in Kaidor's eyes, flickering with a guilt older than the pines, something stirred, a recognition that rank might shatter like ice under the weight of destiny. The wind howled on, carrying the first flakes of a coming storm as Brenna's world teetered on the edge of revelation. The snow fell thicker now, veiling the ravine's scars in a shroud of white, as if the earth itself sought to bury the night's violence. Brenna's shoulder throbbed with each breath, a relentless pulse that echoed the distant huevos fading into the pines. She lay cradled in Kaidor's arms, her body limp against the unyielding warmth of his chest, the scent of him, iron, fur, and the faint underlying musk of alpha resolve invading her senses like an unwelcome tide. Pain sharpened her world to fragments, the rough weave of his cloak against her cheek, the metallic drip of blood from her wound soaking into the fabric, the king's heartbeat steady beneath her ear, a rhythm that mocked her own faltering one. He carried her without a word, his strides long and deliberate through the deepening drifts, the pack falling into formation around them like shadows guarding a flame. No one spoke of the arrow's path, of how an Omega's whim had bent fate's cruel arc. But their glances lingered, heavy with questions unspoken, as if her blood had rewritten the invisible lines of hierarchy. Brenna's mind reeled, denial coiling tight in her gut. This was no destiny, it was delirium, born of the cold and the shock. She had acted on impulse, the wind's warning screaming in her veins, nothing more. To see more in it, to feel that pull, that instinctive tether snagging at her core, was to invite madness. Kaidor's breath clouded the air above her, warm gusts stirring her hair. "Hold on, Scout," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her bones. There was no command in it, only a quiet urgency that betrayed the king beneath the warrior, the man who had lost too much to lose another without fight. She wanted to snap back, to demand he set her down and let the snow claim what was hers by right of exile. But exhaustion pinned her tongue, and beneath it a flicker of curiosity. Why did his presence ease the fire in her flesh, as if his nearness wove a fragile ward against the dark? The procession pushed onward, away from the ravine's bloodied heart, toward the shadowed flanks of Cold Reach's higher ridges. The wind howled in protest, whipping flakes into stinging veils that blurred the world to ghosts. Brenna's vision swam, the moon's silver gaze fracturing through the storm like shattered ice. She had always navigated by such lights, reading the stars' cold counsel when pack bonds offered none. Now, that gaze felt accusatory, illuminating the folly of her choice. What had she gained? A king's fleeting gratitude, perhaps, before the Alphas dismissed her once more as a tool dulled by use. A growl rippled through the ranks. Low, warning. Kaidor halted, his body tensing like a bowstring drawn. "Riders!" one of his betas snarled, scenting the air. Shadowclaw stragglers, circling back. The enemy had not fled entirely. The truce's fragility hung by a thread, and in these border wilds, one king's passage was another's provocation. Brenna stirred, instinct sharpening through the haze of pain. Her nose twitched at the intruder's reek, sweat-soured hides and oiled blades, closing from the east, where the pines thinned into open slopes. "Leave me," she whispered, her voice cracking like thin ice. "I'm no use now." But Kaidor ignored her, shifting her weight to one arm as he drew his sword with the other, the blade's edge catching the moon's gleam like a promise of retribution. The pack fanned out, a wall of steel and fang, but the assassins were cunning, using the storm's fury to mask their approach. The first struck from the tree line, a cloaked figure leaping with a dagger aimed at Kaidor's exposed flank. Brenna's world tilted as he pivoted, her wound tearing anew with the motion, but she twisted in his grasp, her free hand snatching a fallen branch from the snow. It was feeble, a scout's desperate grasp, but she swung it true, cracking against the attacker's wrist with a snap that echoed the wind's wail. The dagger spun away, buried in the drift, and Kaidor finished the foe with a swift thrust, blood blooming dark against the white. More came then, shadows detaching from the gale, 3, 4, their eyes feral slits in the night. The king fought like a tempest contained, his movements precise, each parry a testament to battles etched into his scars. Yet vulnerability shadowed him. Carrying her slowed him, invited the blade's kiss. Fear clawed at Brenna, not for herself, but for the man who held her life as lightly as his own. The bond stirred again, unbidden, a warmth uncoiling in her chest amid the chill. It was fear, she told herself, and curiosity. What drove a king to risk all for a nameless Omega? One assassin broke through, lunging low. Kaidor staggered, boots slipping on ice, and Brenna acted once more, shoving against him with her good arm to unbalance the foe. The Shadowclaw tumbled, exposed, and a beta's axe ended the threat in a crimson arc. The skirmish ended as swiftly as it began, the last attackers fleeing into the storm's maw, their howls swallowed by the wind. Silence fell, broken only by the pack's ragged breaths and the soft patter of snow on fur. Kaidor lowered her gently against a boulder, his eyes meeting hers in the moon's pale wash. Up close, the guilt in them was a chasm, deep as the ravines they had left. "You fight like one born to it," he said, voice laced with something akin to wonder or warning. His fingers brushed her uninjured arm, a touch that sent sparks through her veins. Instinctive, denied. She pulled away, the connection too raw, too fraught with the ghosts of her rejections. We pressed to the refuge cave, he commanded the pack, but his gaze lingered on her, curiosity mirroring her own. As they moved again, the wind carrying the faint, coppery scent of fresh blood, Brenna felt the tether tighten. Not love, not yet, only the fragile bridge of shared peril, empathy flickering like embers in the cold. The cave loomed ahead, its mouth a black yawn promising shelter, where walls of ice-draped stone might force truths from the shadows. In that hollow reprieve, as the storm raged without, the king knelt to tend her wound, his hands steady with the care of one who knew redemption's cost. The pack watched from the edges, their loyalty shifting like sand under moontide, from rank to something deeper, unnamed. And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel and at what moments of the night they find you. The cave's maw swallowed them whole, a jagged throat carved by forgotten glaciers, its walls glistening with veins of ice that wept in the torchlight. Brenna's breath came in shallow rasps, the air inside thick with the mineral tang of stone and the faint, acrid bite of smoke from the pack's hastily kindled fire. Kydor had lowered her onto a bed of pine boughs and furs, scavenged from the saddlebags, the king's own cloak draped over her like a shield against the encroaching chill. Pain clawed at her shoulder, a relentless fire that no amount of will could quench. But it was the weight of eyes upon her that truly pinned her down. The pack's silent vigil, their forms huddled in the flickering shadows, breaths sinking to the storm's distant roar outside. She shifted, wincing as the rough weave scraped her skin and met Kydor's gaze across the flames. He knelt there, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his hands stained with her blood as he bound the wound with strips torn from a spare tunic. The fabric pulled taut, a makeshift suture that bit deeper than the arrow had, but his touch was deliberate, almost reverent. No Alpha's brusque efficiency, but the careful grace of one who had stitched too many fates back from the brink. Up close, the lines etched into his face told stories she had only heard in whispers, the betrayal that had felled his first mate under a blood moon, the guilt that hollowed his commands like wind through bone. 39 winters had tempered him, not broken him, yet melancholy clung to him like frost on iron. Why? The word escaped her lips, raw and unbidden, as he tied off the bandage. Not the instinct that had flung her into the arrow's path, but this, his attention, undivided, as if she were more than a scout's fleeting utility. The pack stirred at her voice, ears pricking, but no one interrupted. The cave held its breath, the fire's crackle underscoring the intimacy of the question. Kydor's hands paused, hovering near her arm, the heat from his skin a counterpoint to the cave's damp cold. His eyes, that deep blue storm, held hers without flinching. "Because fate does not ask permission," he replied, voice low, threaded with the gravel of exhaustion. "And neither did you." There was no accusation in it, only a mirroring of her own denial, the instinctive pull they both resisted, rationalized as the haze of battle or the Omega-Alpha divide. Yet in the fire's glow, reflected in the silver torque at his throat, a relic from his crowning, etched with lunar phases, something shifted. Empathy, perhaps, born not of pity, but of shared isolation. Her exile in the borders, his throne ringed by ghosts. The wind howled beyond the entrance, a feral chorus that rattled loose stones and carried the faint, guttural snarls of pursuit. Shadowclaw had not relinquished their hunt. The truce was a frayed rope, and Kydor's passage through Coldreach a spark to their powder. A beta rose from the shadows, sniffing the air, his hackles rising. "They're tracking us, my king. The storm masks their numbers, but I sent at least a dozen, closing from the ridge." Brenna's instincts flared, sharp, despite the fever creeping through her veins. She pushed upright, ignoring the blaze in her shoulder, her good hand fumbling for the dagger at her belt. "The eastern tunnel," she murmured, nodding toward a narrow fissure in the cave wall, half veiled by icicles. "It branches to the hot springs, old scout paths, hidden by steam vents. They won't expect it." Her voice carried the weight of years spent mapping these wilds, where Omegas like her learned survival in the margins, dismissed until needed. Kydor studied her, curiosity deepening the furrow between his brows, then nodded once, decisive. "Lead us, then." No hesitation, no deference to rank. In that command lay a quiet yielding, a recognition that her knowledge wove the thread of their escape. The pack mobilized in silence, dousing the fire to embers, gathering gear with the efficiency of wolves long schooled in peril. Brenna rose on unsteady legs, Kydor's arm steadying her without request. a touch that sent unwelcome warmth uncoiling through her core, like sunlight piercing winter's veil. She leaned into it briefly, the contact a bridge over the chasm of her solitude, before pulling away, rationalizing it as necessity. They slipped into the fissure, the air growing humid and sulphurous, the stone walls closing like a lover's embrace turned confining. Torchlight danced erratically, casting elongated shadows that twisted like specters on the damp rock. Brenna led, her steps measured against the pain's rhythm, senses attuned to the drip of water and the muffled howls echoing from the main chamber. Behind her, Kaidor's presence was a bulwark, his sword sheathed but ready, the pack a fluid extension of his will. The bond stirred again, insidious, not love, but a tether of mutual reliance, empathy forging links where hierarchy had failed. The tunnel widened into a cavern laced with steam, the hot springs bubbling in crystalline pools that steamed against the cold influx from cracks above. Moonlight filtered through a high vent, silvering the vapors into ethereal veils, turning the space into a lunar sanctum. But respite was fleeting. The snarls grew nearer, claws scraping stone as Shadowclaw breached the cave mouth. "They've found the entrance!" a warrior hissed, drawing steel. Ambush reversed. The pack turned the narrow pass into a choke point, Kaidor positioning himself at the fore with Brenna at his side, her dagger gripped white-knuckled. The first assailant burst through, eyes wild with bloodlust, only to meet Kaidor's blade in a spray of red that steamed on the warm stone. More followed, a tide of fur and fang, but the terrain favored the defenders, the steam blinding, the pools slick underfoot. Brenna struck true, her blade finding a throat as an attacker lunged past the king, her movement fueled by the raw surge of protection, not for rank, but for the man whose guilt mirrored her own hidden scars. One foe broke through, tackling Kaidor to the ground near a pool's edge, the king's roar mingling with the hiss of water. Brenna dove forward, shoulder screaming, and drove her dagger into the attacker's flank, twisting until the body went limp. She collapsed beside him, breaths mingling in the steam, his hand finding hers in the chaos, a grip that anchored, not commanded. The pack dispatched the rest, bodies littering the stone like fallen leaves, blood mingling with the spring's mineral flow, turning it a deep, accusing crimson. As silence reclaimed the cavern, Kaidor pulled her close, not in triumph, but in quiet acknowledgement, the moon's light bathing them in silver absolution. The empathy had deepened, a bond woven from shared defiance, where fear yielded to fragile trust. In his eyes, she saw not a king appraising a subordinate, but a soul glimpsing redemption's distant shore. The steam curled around them like whispered prophecies, the water's warmth seeping into her bones, easing the cold of exile, if only for this breath. Yet the night pressed on, enemies routed but the greater storm, the unraveling truce, the ghosts of betrayals past, loomed beyond the steam's veil, demanding choices yet unmade. Steam rose in languid spirals from the hot springs, weaving through the cavern like the breath of ancient spirits, carrying the metallic tang of blood and the earthy musk of exertion. Brenna slumped against the slick stone, her dagger slipping from numb fingers to clatter into the shallow pool at her feet, ripples distorting the moon's fractured reflection. The warmth seeped into her skin, a balm against the feverish ache in her shoulder, but it could not touch the deeper tremor uncoiling within her, a stirring she had long buried, dismissed as the Omega's curse of heightened senses, nothing more. Kaidor's hand lingered on hers, calloused and steady, his touch a anchor in the steam-shrouded haze, yet it ignited something forbidden, a pulse in her veins that hummed with the moon's silver call, pulling at threads she dared not unravel. The pack moved like shadows in the aftermath, dragging the fallen into the deeper pools where the waters would claim their forms, erasing the evidence of violence under a veil of minerals and heat. Whispers rippled among them, low and reverent, eyes flicking to Brenna not with the old indifference, but with a dawning awe that bordered on unease. She felt it like a weight, their gazes probing the invisible scars of her exile. The years spent as a ghost in the borderlands, her warnings unheeded until blood proved them true. Kaidor rose slowly, his silhouette etched against the high vent where moonlight poured in like liquid silver, illuminating the crimson streaks on his armor. He extended a hand, not as king to subject, but as one survivor to another, and she took it, the contact sending a jolt through her core, warm and insistent, like the first thaw after endless winter. "You see paths others miss," he said, voice a quiet thunder amid the drip of water and the faint hiss of steam. It was not praise, but observation, laced with the melancholy that shadowed his every word, the guilt of a ruler who had failed to see the blade until it struck. Brenna pulled away, the bond resisting her retreat, a silken thread tightening with each denial. She rationalized it as the cave's humid closeness, the adrenaline's cruel jest, but deep in her chest, where the moon's light pooled, doubt flickered. What if it was more? What if the wind's secrets she had always chased were not mere instinct, but a gift, hidden like a blade in snow? The cavern trembled then, a low rumble vibrating through the stone, dust sifting from the ceiling like fine ash. The pack froze, ears pricking at the sound, not the storm's fury, but something subterranean, a groan from the earth's frozen heart. "The ridge is shifting," a beta growled, sniffing the sulphurous air. Avalanche from the skirmish, stones loosened. Panic edged their voices. The hot springs were a sanctuary, but one precariously balanced on Coldreach's volatile bones. Kaidor scanned the fissures, his jaw set in lines carved by too many close calls, but the main tunnel back was blocked now, a cascade of rubble sealing their escape like a tomb's lid. Brenna's breath caught, the moon's gaze intensifying through the vent, bathing her in a chill that cut through the steam's embrace. It called to her, insistent, awakening the dormant fire in her blood. She had felt it before, in the borderlands' endless nights, when the pack scouts lost their way in blizzards, and she alone found the hidden trails, guided by visions that bloomed behind her eyes like frost flowers. They had called it luck or omega intuition, but never delved deeper. To name it would elevate her, and elevation for one like her invited only sharper falls. Now, with the pack's eyes upon her, the gift surged unbidden, a revelation she could no longer deny. Closing her eyes, she let the moon's light flood her senses, the world tilting into ethereal clarity. Paths unfurled in her mind, not maps of stone and snow, but luminous veins pulsing beneath the cavern's skin. A narrow crevice to the west, veiled by steam, leading to an forgotten ascent toward the lunar temple ruins. Another, treacherous, veering east into Shadowclaw territory, but swift. Symbols danced in the visions, silver threads weaving through crimson pools, the torque at Kaidor's throat gleaming like a beacon. Her hidden gift, the Pathfinder's mark, manifested as a spiritual compass, revealing not just routes, but destinies intertwined, where choices forked like ravines under the Deuce's watchful eye. She gasped, eyes snapping open, the cave sharpening into focus. There. She pointed to the western wall, where a faint crack wept vapor, invisible to all but her inner sight. "It leads up, steep but clear. The temple's shadow will shield us till dawn." The words spilled out, laced with certainty that bordered on prophecy, her voice echoing strangely in the humid air. The pack hesitated, murmurs rising like steam, but Kaidor stepped forward, his gaze locking onto hers with piercing intensity. In that moment, he saw it, the key to his fractured fate, the Omega who had shielded him not by chance, but by design. Guilt warred in his eyes, the weight of his past betrayals clashing with this new revelation. She was no mere scout, but the thread to mend his unraveling realm, her gift a lunar decree that demanded he confront the mercy he had long withheld from himself. "You are more than exile," he murmured, close enough that his breath stirred the damp curls at her temple, the bond flaring bright, resisted yet undeniable. Brenna recoiled inwardly, the vision's clarity a double-edged blade, freedom in knowledge, but chains in the expectations it birthed. Was this redemption or another cage? The pack stirred, following her lead into the crevice, the stones scraping like whispers of fate as they climbed. Moonlight followed, silvering their path, blood from the springs staining the rocks below like an offering to the Diusa. Yet as they ascended, the greater storm brewed, not of snow, but of souls, the Shadowclaw's pursuit, the unraveling truce, and the moral crossroads looming where Kaidor's guilt demanded a choice between throne and heart, power and the compassion she embodied. The wind howled through the cracks, carrying weavos of distant wolves, a reminder that revelation was but the spark, the fire of rebirth awaited, testing if destiny could be chosen or only endured. Subscribe if you believe mercy can crown even the fallen. Comment, Luna, if you'd walk through the storm for someone who saw the crevice clawed upward like the ribs of some ancient beast, its jagged edges scraping against Brenna's palms as she climbed, the stone's chill seeping through her bandages like a lover's cold regret. Moonlight slanted through fissures above, painting their ascent in silver streaks that danced with the steam's lingering ghosts, turning sweat and blood into ethereal masks on their faces. Her shoulder burned with every pull, a forge's hammer reshaping her resolve, but the true fire raged within. The Pathfinder's gift now a relentless tide, visions flickering at the edges of her sight like half-remembered dreams. Paths branched in her mind's eye, not just of rock and ridge, but of fates. Kaidor's throne crumbling under betrayal's weight, her own exile echoing in the howls of a pack that might yet claim her as kin or condemn her as curse. Kaidor moved behind her, his presence a steady heat against the damp air, his gloved hand brushing her boot in silent support whenever the incline steepened. The bond thrummed between them, no longer a whisper but a pulse, resisted with the ferocity of one who had learned trust's bitter cost. She rationalized it still, the moon's pull on Omega blood, the shared peril forging false intimacies. But each glance back met his eyes, deep as frozen lakes, holding not command, but a quiet plea for understanding. His guilt was a shadow she could almost taste. Metallic and old, born of the night his first mate fell to a traitor's blade, her blood staining the snow of his coronation under a blood moon. He had ruled since with ethical steel, but melancholy had hollowed him, turning duty into a throne of thorns. The pack followed in taut silence, their breaths ragged echoes in the narrow vein, weapons sheathed but senses razor-sharp. Whispers had spread like frost on glass. The Omega scout who saw hidden ways, who shielded the king not once but thrice. Rank frayed in their murmurs, loyalty shifting from iron oaths to something fluid, lunar, recognition of the Diusa's hand in her visions. Yet doubt lingered, a chill wind through the crevice, for Shadowclaw's pursuit bayed closer, their weavos threading the night like accusations. The truce teetered, a fragile ice shelf over abyss, and Brenna's gift illuminated the peril. The rival Alpha, Thorn Blackvein, waited in the temple ruins above, not as hunter, but as architect of the unraveling, his betrayal the poison seeping through pack lines. They emerged into the lunar temple's shadowed nave, a ruin cradled in cold reach's crown, its columns of weathered marble thrusting skyward like broken prayers. Snow dusted the cracked altar at the center, where a massive silver disk, the Deuce's eye, caught the moon's full gaze, refracting light into prismatic veils that bathed the space in otherworldly glow. Icicles hung from arched ceilings like frozen tears, and the air hummed with spiritual weight. The wind's howl muted to a sacred murmur. Brenna staggered to a halt, her vision blooming vivid, crimson threads linking Thorn's form in the tree line beyond, his silhouette flanked by iron-fanged defectors, her own pack's kin, faces twisted in the greed of promised power. The traitor revealed, not a shadow but a wolf she knew. Garrick, her former alpha, whose dismissal had driven her to the borders, now allying with rivals for the crown's fracture. Kaidor sensed it too, his body coiling like a spring as he drew his sword, the blade's edge whispering against the scabbard. "They come," he growled, voice laced with the gravel of foretold sorrow. The pack fanned out, forming a defensive crescent around the altar, but Brenna stepped forward, the gift surging, a moral crossroads etched in light. Visions forked, war's blaze consuming all, blood painting the temple in rivers of red, or mercy's path, forgiveness offered to the traitors, binding wounds with compassion's fragile thread. Her heart clenched, the Omega in her screaming for freedom from these chains of destiny, while the Pathfinder urged revelation. To choose love was to risk all, not as reward, but as proof, redeeming the king's guilt through her own rebirth. Thorn Blackvein emerged first from the pines, a hulking figure in armor chased with black iron, his eyes gleaming yellow under the moon like a predator's promise. Flanking him, Garrick, broad and scarred, his muzzle grayed by years of unchallenged rule, met Brenna's gaze with a snarl that twisted into shock. "The border ghost," he spat, voice echoing off the stones. "You lead them to slaughter now? Join us, Omega. The king's throne crumbles. Thorn offers true pack, where your sight might earn rank, not scraps." The words struck like wind-lashed hail, dredging the exiles of her past. Garrick's dismissals, the pack's indifference as she scouted alone, her warnings of raids ignored until siblings lay cold. Rage boiled in her veins, hot as the hot spring's depths, urging war, claws and steel to avenge the years stolen. But Kaidor's hand on her arm steadied her, his touch a question. What is strength, if not choosing mercy amid the storm? His guilt mirrored hers, the betrayal that felled his mate echoing Garrick's neglect. To strike would perpetuate the cycle, power's illusion over compassion's truth. "Thorn!" Kaidor called, stepping beside her, sword lowered but ready, his voice a bridge over the chasm. "The truce holds by Deuce's grace. Betrayal stains us all. End this and face judgment in council, not blood." It was ethical plea from a melancholic king, offering forgiveness, not from weakness, but from the wisdom of one who knew war's hollow crown. Thorn laughed, a guttural bark that shattered the temple's hush, but Garrick hesitated, eyes flicking to Brenna, the weight of her visions pressing like the moon's gaze. She felt the choice tear at her core, love or liberty, to bind to this king and his redemption, or flee the pack's games into solitary winds. The bond pulled, insistent, his nearness a warmth against the snow's bite, promising not ease, but shared burden. Visions clarified. Mercy could crown the fallen, weaving her gift into the realm's salvation, but at freedom's cost. War would grant escape, yet doom the fragile trust blooming between them. Weavos rose from the tree line, Shadowclaw reinforcements closing, the air thick with the scent of pine and impending blood. Brenna raised her hand, the Pathfinder's light pulsing faint in her palm, a silver glow that halted the advance. "Garrick," she said, voice steady as the altar stone, emotion raw in the wind's caress. "You cast me out, but I see your path still, twisted by fear, not fate. Choose now, war and die in snow, or mercy, and rebuild what you've broken." The words hung, a dilemma spiritual and visceral, her heart pounding with the ethical precipice. Kaidor's gaze burned into her, pride and longing intertwined, the bond flaring as he whispered, "You are the key I never sought." Thorn lunged then, shattering the moment, his axe arcing in a crimson promise under the moon. The pack met him in clash of steel and fang, blood spraying the altar like sacrificial wine, the temple alive with war's brutal symphony. Brenna fought at Kaidor's side, dagger flashing, her visions guiding strikes through the chaos. Mercy offered, but freedom's choice deferred in the fire of survival. Garrick circled, traitor's eyes conflicted, the moral storm raging as fierce as the wind, demanding if redemption could bloom from such fractured soil, or if war would claim them all in eternal winter's grasp. The temple's marble veins pulsed with the frenzy of battle, moonlight fracturing across blades like shattered prophecies, each clash a thunder that reverberated through Brenna's bones. Blood slicked the snow-dusted floor, warm rivulets tracing the cracks toward the altar's silver disk, where the Deusa's eye seemed to watch with indifferent grace. Thorn's axe whistled through the air, a brutal arc that Kaidor parried with his sword, the impact jarring sparks into the night, illuminating the king's face, etched with the raw etchings of guilt, not rage. Brenna moved at his flank, her dagger an extension of instinct, the Pathfinder's visions a luminous haze guiding her strikes. A shadow claw lunging from the shadows, his throat exposed in the moon's silver wash. Another circling Garrick, whose conflicted snarl betrayed the traitor's fracturing resolve. Pain lanced her shoulder with every twist, a forge's relentless tempering, but it sharpened her senses. The coppery reek of spilled life mingling with pine frost, the wet thud of bodies yielding to steel. The wind's mournful sigh through the ruined arches. She had chosen mercy's edge, offering Garrick a path untainted by vengeance, yet war had claimed the moment, its visceral tide drowning words in crimson. Freedom or love? The dilemma clawed at her core, the bond with Kaidor a silken noose tightening with each shared breath, his presence a warmth that defied the temple's chill. He fought not for glory, but redemption. Each parry a atonement for the mate lost to betrayal, his ethical heart refusing the brute's crown of conquest. Thorn pressed forward, a behemoth of black iron and feral hunger, his axe cleaving a beta's guard in a spray of red that steamed against the cold stone. "Your throne bleeds, Rune," he bellowed, voice a guttural roar that shook icicles from the eaves, shattering them like fragile oaths. Kaidor countered, his blade nicking the rival's pauldron, drawing first blood, a thin line of crimson that mirrored the deeper wounds of trust eroded. Brenna darted low, her vision unveiling Thorn's feint, a swing wide to expose his side, inviting the kill. She struck, dagger biting into tendon behind his knee, the alpha stumbling with a howl that twisted the air, pain's echo mingling with distant weavos from the pines. Garrick broke from the fray then, his form a blur of gray fur and scarred hide, not charging but retreating toward the tree line, eyes locked on Brenna with a desperation that bordered on plea. The Pathfinder's light flared in her mind, illuminating his path, not escape, but surrender, a fork where mercy could sever the cycle of exile that had birthed her own solitude. "Brenna," he rasped, voice cracking over the din, pawing at the snow as if to unearth buried truths. "The borders broke me too. Thorn promised power, but its chains. Forgive, or end it." His words hung, a spiritual precipice, forcing her to confront the Omega's ghost within. The girl dismissed, siblings lost to ignored warnings, rank's cold indifference forging her into wind and shadow. She hesitated, dagger poised, the bond with Kaidor pulling like lunar gravity. His glance over his shoulder, blue eyes stormy with understanding, urging not vengeance, but the compassion he himself sought. What is forgiveness, if not the strength to release the blade before it drinks? The question echoed in her veins, philosophy woven into the battle's rhythm, her heart a drumbeat against the ethical storm. Thorn recovered, lunging at Kaidor with renewed fury, axe grazing the king's arm in a shallow gash that bloomed red, soaking his fur cloak. Brenna whirled, visions cascading. If she struck Garrick down, war would consume the packs, her freedom a Pyrrhic solitude amid ruins. If mercy prevailed, union with Kaidor meant binding her gift to his throne, rebirth not as exile but as mate, love's proof in shared sacrifice. The pack rallied, their forms a whirlwind of steel and fang around the altar. Loyalty no longer rigid hierarchy but fluid tide, drawn to the Omega who saw destinies unfold. A Shadowclaw enforcer broke through, tackling Brenna to the marble, his claws raking her side in fiery trails that mingled with her shoulder's ache. She gasped, the world blurring to white-hot pain and the moon's unyielding gaze, but Kaidor's roar cut the night. A primal surge as he hurled the attacker aside, blade sinking deep into furred flesh. He knelt over her, bloodied hand cupping her face, thumb tracing the scar along her jaw from border skirmishes long past. "Not without you," he murmured, voice raw with the melancholy of one who had buried too many under snow, his guilt fracturing like ice under her touch. The bond ignited, undeniable now, a spiritual flame that warmed the temple's frozen heart, empathy transmuting to something deeper. Acceptance, resisted no longer, rationalized as fate's inexorable weave. Garrick charged then, not at her, but at Thorn, axe raised in betrayal's reversal, clashing with the rival Alpha in a frenzy of sparks and snarls, his choice a mirror to hers. "No more shadows," he bellowed, the words a catharsis that shattered the air. The pack surged, turning the tide, blades finding throats as visions guided Brenna's cries. "Yield!" Mercy crowned the chaos, Thorn falling to his knees, weapon clattering to the stone, his yellow eyes dimming to defeat's gray. Garrick knelt beside him, bloodied but unbowed, offering fealty to Kaidor with a nod that bridged old wounds, forgiveness not as weakness, but rebirth's first breath. Brenna rose, leaning into Kaidor's side, the warmth of him seeping through her chills, the temple's moonlight bathing them in absolution's glow. The battle ebbed, bodies strewn like offerings, blood pooling toward the Deuce's eye in crimson rivers that reflected stars unseen. Yet victory tasted of ash. The truce mended, but at what cost? Her gift hummed, revealing the final fork. Sacrifice her solitary winds for union's hearth, healing the king's guilt through love's redemptive fire, or claim liberty's cold embrace, leaving destiny to unravel alone. Kaidor's arm encircled her, tentative, a question in the press of his body, the choice moral and visceral, love not reward but proof, demanding she choose if rebirth meant surrender or sovereignty. The wind whispered through the arches, carrying the faint patter of fresh snow. As the pack gathered around their fallen foes, the night holding its breath for the soul's verdict. In that suspended hush, Brenna felt the moon's pull deepen, urging not despair, but the dawn of chosen fate, where compassion could forge queens from exiles and guilt yield to grace's unyielding light. The temple's arches sighed with the wind's weary passage, carrying the last echoes of clashing steel into the indifferent night, where snowflakes spiraled like errant souls seeking rest. Brenna stood amid the carnage, her side a lattice of fresh gashes that wept crimson into the marble's veins, mingling with the blood of foes and kin alike. The moon hung full and unyielding above the ruins, its silver light pooling on the altar like spilled mercury, illuminating the silver torque at Kaidor's throat, a symbol of his burdened crown, now etched deeper with the night's toll. Her breath came in shallow clouds, each one tasting of iron and pine, the Pathfinder's gift ebbing like a tide, leaving her hollowed, exposed. Visions had guided them through the storm, but now they whispered of endings, not death, but the raw unraveling of self, where exile's chains might shatter or bind anew. Kaidor released Thorn to the pack's unyielding grip, the rival Alpha's form dragged into the shadows, his yellow eyes dulled to the gray of capitulation. Garrick knelt before them both, head bowed, the scars on his muzzle silvered by moonlight, his surrender a bridge forged from the ashes of betrayal. "I chose wrong," he rasped, voice cracking like frost under boot, the weight of years, dismissals, ignored warnings, the blood of lost scouts, hanging between him and Brenna like a specter. She met his gaze, the Omega's old wounds pulsing hot in her chest, the siblings' graves in border snow, her solitude a wind-scoured path no one followed. Mercy had crowned the battle, sparing his life, but forgiveness. It tasted of salt on her tongue, a choice that demanded she release the rage coiling in her gut, not for his sake, but for the rebirth it promised her own fractured spirit. The pack encircled them, a ring of furred silhouettes etched in moonlight and torch glow, their breath sinking to the temple's sacred hush. No longer did they eye her as the border ghost, the expendable Omega. In her vision's light, they saw the mate who had woven paths through stone and fate, her shield against the arrow, a prophecy fulfilled. Yet the recognition pressed like the cold stone beneath her feet. Loyalty's new shape, heavy with expectation, threatening to eclipse the freedom she had carved from rejection's blade. Kaidor turned to her, his arm brushing hers, the contact a spark that ignited the bond's full blaze, warmth flooding her veins, chasing the chill of exile, his scent, steel-forged resolve laced with melancholic earth, wrapping around her like a cloak against the gathering storm. "You offered them grace," he said softly, his blue eyes holding the depth of frozen fjords, guilt's shadows softening in the moon's absolution. At 39, he was no untamed force, but a king tempered by loss, the first mate's betrayal, a ghost that had haunted his decrees, turning power into penance. His hand cupped her elbow, steadying her sway, and in that touch lay the question unspoken. Would she choose this union, healing his wounds through hers, or vanish into the winds that had always been her sole companion? The bond thrummed, insistent, no longer resisted but confronted, rationalized once as instinct's cruel mirage, now accepted as truth's unyielding pull. Love not a balm, but a forge, demanding sacrifice to temper their souls. Brenna's heart hammered, a visceral drum against the ethical precipice. Freedom beckoned from the temple's eastern arch, where the pines whispered of solitary trails, her gift unbound by throne or pack, destiny bent to her will alone. Yet the visions lingered, crimson threads linking her to Kaidor. His guilt mended not by conquest, but by the compassion she embodied, her rebirth as queen a redemption that transcended hierarchies. To walk away would grant liberty's cold sovereignty, leaving him to his melancholic crown, the packs to fracture under unresolved betrayals. To stay, to bind as mate, meant yielding her windswept exile for shared fire, love's proof in the daily choice of mercy over might, faith triumphing over despair's howl. The wind rose, keening through the columns like a deuce's lament, stirring snow into eddies that danced around their feet, flecking bloodied fur with white purity. A distant weavo pierced the night, shadowclaw remnants scattering, the truce's fragile weave holding by the thread of this night's mercy. Garrick rose at Kaidor's nod, stepping back into the pack's fold, his presence a tentative stitch in the realm's torn fabric. Brenna felt the weight of it all, the blood underfoot, steaming faintly in the cold, the moon's gaze, warm on her skin despite the frost, Kaidor's nearness, a hearth against the void. What is rebirth, if not choosing the flame over endless night? The philosophy settled in her bones, no longer abstract but visceral, her scars, old and new, a map of the path chosen. She turned to him, her slate eyes meeting his storm-deep ones, the bond sealing with a quiet certainty that needed no words. Her hand found his, fingers intertwining over the silver torque, its lunar etchings pulsing like a shared heartbeat. "Not alone," she whispered, voice steady as the altar stone, the sacrifice complete. Her freedom offered for union's healing grace, his guilt absolved in the light of her unyielding choice. Kaidor pulled her close, his embrace a bulwark against the wind, lips brushing her temple in a kiss born of redemption's fire, tender amid the tragedy. Proof that love could crown the fallen, weaving Omega and Alpha into destiny's unbreakable weave. The pack howled then, a chorus rising to the moon, not of triumph but spiritual renewal, Weavos blending with the wind's song as snow fell thicker, veiling the temple in white forgiveness. Brenna leaned into him, the cold yielding to warmth, her gift humming softly now, a compass not for solitary paths, but for the realm's mended heart. Exile's shadow lifted, rebirth dawning in the moon's embrace, where rejection bloomed into royalty, and guilt found grace's eternal flame. If your heart beat alongside ours, like, comment, and subscribe. Because every soul that joins our moon keeps the flame of redemption alive.